In this short film, I'd like to talk about the teleological argument for the existence of God, otherwise known as the design argument for God. Now there's a lot to talk about here, so I'll just limit this to classic versions of the argument, some of the key scholars from history. In fact, there's been a very heated debate over the argument for a number of years, and particularly in modern times have been attempts to produce new and varied versions of the argument to respond to some of the criticisms. That would take a lot of discussing, and perhaps I'll save that for a later film. I'm just going to give quite an introductory and short presentation today, and perhaps we can come on to the criticisms of the argument and modern scholars on another occasion. Firstly, there's some technical terms to deal with. What do we mean by teleological? Well, in philosophy, the word teleological comes from the Greek word telos, meaning an end or a purpose. So a teleological argument looks at the concept of purpose or intent, or an end point. So arguing that the world is the end result of God's purpose, shows signs of his intentions, is to argue a teleological argument. You can see the link then with the concept of design and the phrase the design argument. If the world shows God's intention to create things deliberately with certain features, that is, by analogy, like the human process of designing objects. Okay, so therefore we'd call it a design argument. There are a few other terms which philosophers use to talk about and classify arguments. One of these is a posteriori. We would call a teleological argument for God a posteriori from the Latin because it's based on our evidence and our experience of the external world. So rather than it being a purely logical thing, an a posteriori argument observes the world around us and tries to draw conclusions from that. We would also classify the argument as inductive. Now this term refers to a form of reasoning, inductive reasoning, whereby the evidence suggests a conclusion and makes it probable, but it doesn't give pure logical certainty. So for example, unlike a mathematical answer, such as 2 + 2 = 4, where in that case you're 100% sure the conclusion's correct, based off that logical certainty, in an inductive argument, you can only ever have a probabilistic conclusion. So for example, it rained yesterday, it rained today, conclusion, it's going to rain tomorrow. That conclusion isn't logically certain, so we'd call that inductive reasoning. The teleological argument then is inductive because it's suggesting God as a possible, perhaps supporters would say very probable, explanation for the world. Now let's talk about a few different forms of the argument. Firstly, I'm going to start off with ancient philosophers and the argument developed by Plato. The teleological argument can be traced back to the ancient world, and you find this idea of design present in a number of ancient traditions and myths. The idea of the gods making the world, a bit like human craftsmen making objects. For example, in the Bible, the world is described as God's handiwork, and famously in the creation story, when God's made the world, he sees it and regards it as good, like a craftsman looking at his work. Now, the first philosopher to really offer a systematic design argument, or something similar to what became recognised as the teleological design argument, was the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And he does this in one of his works, a dialogue, a conversation he writes about, called the Timaeus. Now here, Plato writes about a craftsman forming the world. He uses this Greek word demiurge. It's like a worker or craftsman, somebody who builds things. And Plato gives this myth about the physical world being formed and put into shape by this creator figure, this demiurge. It's not an argument for the god of classical theism, or the Christian god, or the Jewish god, or the god of Islam, but it is an argument for the idea that divine purpose can be seen in the shape and the pattern of the world, and the idea of an analogy that the world is like a manufactured object. And if you think about it, you can see why the ancient Greeks and other civilizations might have thought this is the case. So, for example, you can think of the stars, the sun and the moon, the seasons. There's lots of regularity, regular time periods, things being predictable in the workings of the world, which I suppose might seem like the regularity of a device. There's the beauty of the world, the way things seem to have a certain purpose or function. Birds are equipped with wings, etc. So the idea that objects within the natural world are shaped by a craftsman might suggest that the whole world is an intelligent, crafted product. And this is something that Plato suggests. Not that the world was created from nothing, as Christians and Jews have come to believe, but Plato suggests maybe the form of the world was shaped, like the material stuff was given form and put into order by a kind of great divine craftsman. And that's the most ancient form of the argument. It was then later developed by other scholars, particularly notably was taken on by Christian scholars, and that's the part of the argument I'm going to talk about now. The next stage in the development of the teleological argument I'd like to highlight is that of the famous Christian philosopher you'll have heard of perhaps and will hear of many times if you studied the philosophy of religion, Thomas Aquinas. He was a monk of the 13th century from Aquino in Italy, but he actually had a multinational family and was a very important and well-connected figure. Now, he wrote this great work on theology called Summa Theologica, which is the summation, the gathering of theology. It's like his masterwork, where he brings everything together. And through that, Aquinas tries to sort out everything you could try to discover or discuss with God. What he's like, whether he exists, his relationship with humans, creation, etc. It's a huge work, and you can read an English translation available on various sites on the internet. But perhaps the most famous part is the part where Aquinas asks whether God exists. And Aquinas feels that he does so, and you can make, he says, 5 good arguments to show that God does exist. And these have been named Aquinas' 5 ways, well, it's not a term he uses throughout history, particularly when we write about history of philosophy now. Aquinas' 5 ways, it's a really common term, and you hear it used over and over again. Now, it's actually the last of these, the 5th way, which seems to be something like a design argument. And it goes a little bit like this. Aquinas says, if you look at the world around you, you can see that many objects work towards some sort of end goal, some sort of purpose which they attain. And you can see that through all kinds of creatures. Like, for example, bees will gather nectar and they will return, they'll work out where the hive is, and they will live communally, and that shows intelligence. Now, Aquinas says, well, this world is full of goal-directed activity, or people, or things, objects, animals, working towards some end, some purposeful end. He says, well, surely the best explanation for some purposeful end is some kind of planning mind. Aquinas uses the word designedly. It's not random that these things reach their goal, it is by design or intention. And he says, well, compare this with an archer shooting an arrow at a target. The arrow reaching the target shows intent. And so just like, a bird migrating south for the winter shows intent, or as the example I gave with bees shows intent, the world is full of goal-directed activity, and Aquinas says there must be some explanation for the purposeful nature of the world. Why is the world filled with so much intelligence, so much thought, planning, working towards purposes. He says, well, the best explanation is that there is a great intelligence or a great mind, a great designer who has created it. And that, of course, is his belief, the supremely perfect God, the God of Christianity. So Aquinas thinks this idea of goal-directed activity of design shows God's existence fairly successfully. And that's the second major version of the argument I want to talk about here. The next one is the classic modern account. When I say modern, I mean after the era of the Enlightenment and after the medieval period. That is of the famous scholar William Paley in 1802. Now, Paley wrote the design argument in his work Natural Theology, and you get a good sense of what he's about from the title of his book. Okay, natural theology is attempting to know God. Theology, study God through means of nature, i.e. studying the world around us, using our reason, our mind, to draw conclusions about that world, and then derive ideas or knowledge about God from the world. You can contrast natural theology with revealed theology. I mean, for example, if God shows himself in a miracle, or he gives us some account of himself through scripture, we say he's revealed himself, revelation. Natural theology is us working things out about God through studying nature. So Paley's whole book is essentially arguing that we can come to conclusions about God through reasoning about nature. And in the opening chapters, he kicks off what is really the classic statement of the design argument. And he does so through an analogy. Basically, Paley's telling a story, a very simple one, but it works very nicely as an argument, I think. That is, imagine you're walking across some heathland and you stumble upon a pocket watch. Now, what would you assume about the watch? Well, says Paley, you wouldn't assume that it always just happened to be there, like a stone. Okay, if you stumbled on a stone and say, oh, it's a stone, it's always been there, we don't need to explain what a stone is doing, just out in the middle of this heathland. If you stumbled on a pocket watch, through your familiarity with pocket watches, what they are, what they're for, what they do, and how they're made, you could draw the conclusion that the watch hadn't always been there, but that it was put there or it was dropped there, etc. And you could say a bit more about the watch as well. You could infer that the watch had been made by a watchmaker. Now, how could you do this? Well, you know it has a purpose, it tells you the time. You know that its parts work with regularity. And it ticks along, and the minute hand moves, and the hour hand moves in regular motion. And the parts inside the watch have been arranged meticulously to fulfill the purpose of telling the time. So from that, the regularity, the purpose, the arrangement, Paley says we have to conclude that the watch has been designed, and an intelligent mind has put together this watch, a watchmaker. Well, that's obvious, but why is that relevant to the design argument, you might ask? Well, Paley says, let's have a look at the world after we've looked at this pocket watch and see whether we can draw any similar conclusions. Well, Paley claims the world also seems to be the product of an intelligent mind, because look, do things have purpose in the natural world? Well, yes, they do. You can see all sorts of organisms work to some purpose, sorts of natural phenomena seem to create other phenomena which are of benefit. For Paley, I suppose the most winning examples were of natural organisms which had parts which functioned in a certain way. In this human, I have eyes, I can see, I've got ears, I can hear, and nose, I can smell. These are like devices, and they work to a purpose. They work supremely well and efficiently. The parts are arranged. There's regularity. And if all of these things are a convincing argument for a watch being designed, Paley says, well, surely they're convincing evidence for theism, that God exists as the supreme designer, the intelligent craftsman who has produced this world. It really shows and reflects the era in which Paley was writing as well. This was the age of great technological advancement, the beginning of the 19th century, and modern science. People learning so much more about the natural world through a series of scientific discoveries. And with that confidence came a confidence in explaining things, and a belief that the beauty of the world uncovered, the greatness of human design, together suggested that the world is a great design, like all these new human designs which were emerging at this time of industry and science. So it seemed that Paley had produced a really knockdown argument. Lastly, I'm going to offer just a few brief reflections, having looked at these three classic forms of the argument. Well, we're leaving it here with Paley's argument, his last argument. It's certainly not the last chapter, but I think if we go beyond Paley, we'll end up with a really long explanation, and we can talk about modern arguments on another occasion. But if we look at Paley, this is in many ways the high point of the teleological argument. It seemed to many utterly convincing. For example, to young Charles Darwin, Paley's proof seemed completely undefeatable. It seemed that he had rationally demonstrated God's existence, because it pulled together several things people thought were important: science, and the discovery of nature, technology, and understanding the human mind and having faith in human reason. And Paley brought all of these things together to show that the wonders of the world, it seemed, highlighted the wonders of God. And at this point in time, it really seemed like the teleological argument was a winner. So you're probably asking yourself, well, how did things change? Things really changed in 1859 with the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, because for many, the idea that complexity, the appearance of design, could evolve rather than being created by a god really undermines the idea that design is necessary to explain the world. Now, we're not going to enter into the criticisms of the argument here, which you can do on another occasion. There are many, and we're not going to look at the argument post-Darwin, but hopefully you can at least appreciate that there was an era in which the argument grew in strength and prominence, but then, with really more modern science, after Charles Darwin, it became a lot more controversial. We'll talk about that later. Just more generally, let's have a few reflections though. Firstly, why might somebody find this argument to be convincing in the first place? I think if you look at it from the positions of Plato, Aquinas and Paley, before our modern 20th century world, or even late 19th century world, there's a lot that the argument has to recommend it. It's a powerful explanatory tool. Okay, we like explanations, and this does a lot of explaining. It says why things are the way they are, why purposes seem to be fulfilled in the world, seems to explain complexity in the world, regularity in the world, purpose in the world. So that's one thing. Secondly, the argument is really simple to understand because it's based off comparison and analogy. You see a human craftsman, you see the greatness, beauty and order of the world. If a craftsman makes great and beautiful objects in the human world, then why can't the whole world be created by a divine craftsman? So it's a really simple, easy to understand argument based off simple analogies. Thirdly, I think the argument draws strength from its a posteriori nature. It's based off evidence and experience. We all experience the world, we experience its beauty, we experience its regularity, the appearance of being crafted, and so we all have our own bank of evidence that we can use to support design arguments. So I think those are the reasons why it's been so successful, and even still, as you may see on another occasion, it has a lot of supporters today. The criticisms, on the other hand, are many and varied, and you'll see if you pick up some modern books, there's a lot of people who have really doubted the argument since Darwin, and although it's making a comeback at the moment, a lot of philosophers don't really think this argument works, as well as many scientists. Well, firstly, there's the evolution point, which I briefly alluded to. If you think that the theory of evolution explains all the appearances of design in organisms, well then you don't need a god to explain why they seem to work so effectively or have such a great appearance of design. There are other criticisms though, and for example you might say the argument proves a certain amount. Okay, maybe there is some kind of designing mind, but that's not the same thing as proving the existence of God that many people claim it does. And does the design argument prove that God loves everyone, that God is all wise, that he is eternal, that he is all powerful, etc.? I'm not sure that it does all that. All that the argument really implies is the capacity to design things and to create things, and it's a jump therefore to say that it proves the existence of the God of classical theism. There are other criticisms you can make as well, that the appearance of the design can be produced by many different things rather than merely a designer. And we can think of lots of examples where we see things which have occurred quite randomly in nature, which look like they've been produced by human craft, but they haven't. For example, if you see a face in the clouds or a shadow which appears like an animal, these things have the appearance of design, but it's a false step to say the appearance of design implies necessarily that there's some sort of designer. Many things could just be an illusion, or perhaps us projecting our idea of God onto what we see. So it's still a hotly debated topic. There are lots of arguments go back and forth, but it's an interesting one. On the one hand, there's definitely a lot of evidence to suggest that the world seems beautiful. It has complex organisms and objects within it. They do fulfill some purpose. But does it mean that you can go so far as to say that a divine designer exists? Well, I suggest you look into it, and hopefully you'll find that debate to be rather interesting.